Welcome to episode 63 of the World Builder's Anvil. As always, I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram, and today's topic, fantasy storytelling, does not have to be a genre unto itself. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Okay, the purpose of today's show is not to get into all the possible genres you can mix into your stories, but it is to make one point. Fantasy is a setting as much as a genre, and in and of itself, in its core, fantasy is usually linked to action. So maybe it's an epic action story or maybe a smaller scale action story. And a lot of times it's involved in supernatural or paranormal as well too. You start to get into some of the punk genres like steampunk, and you could probably make an argument that those are fantasy. Maybe or maybe not. It kind of depends on how you define fantasy versus science fiction, or in this case, steampunk. But, really, the thing you have to keep in mind when you're storytelling is there are great elements in many different genres. And you do see this a lot today in certain areas. For example, there's a lot of romance fantasy. There's erotic fantasy. There's urban fantasy. There are all kinds of subgenres that are pretty popular right now that bring things together for people in a way they seem convincing, in a way they enjoy. And that's ultimately the goal of storytelling, is to make your avatar pleased with the story you're telling. Now, the nice thing with fantasy is because it's really a setting or certain kinds of elements you're bringing into a story, you have no limitations on the types of stories you want to tell. Whether you want to tell a thriller or an action story, it could be strictly a psychological thriller. It could completely be about supernatural or horror or romance. Whatever kind of story you want to tell, you can in a fantasy genre. Because the setting is really what makes it fantasy. And there's certain kinds of things that people are going to expect to see, but in all of those, you don't necessarily even need to deal with. For example, you don't need a magic system in a fantasy world. I think that is a misnomer. Because there usually is magic. You do have sort of more low magic worlds, and you have higher magic worlds where magic becomes more common, or like D and Frost, you can have a world where everyone has magic. And so on the other end of that, you can have a world with no magic if you want. So all of those elements are there. It can be on Earth. It doesn't need to be on an Earth-like world or an alien world. You might or might not need more than one race. That race does not have to be human. There are really no limits to you as a storyteller. The thing you have to sort of determine is who is the avatar, the people you want to consume your story. What do you think are they going to enjoy and want to participate in, especially when you're asking them for money. The difference between a role-playing game and, a video game or having them buy some kind of media content like a book from you is the fact that you're actually asking these people to give you money. And, or hopefully you are. And if you are, they're going to have a certain expectation of quality. They're going to have a certain expectation of content. And you want to deliver that to your audience. And you might even find that the initial thought of who your avatar is might change when you start actually selling for the first time. For example, I think I know who my avatar is, but I'm not 100% positive until I start selling. And some of the elements and storytelling techniques I use might vary as I go further into books. Or I might write certain books towards one avatar and other books towards another. So that's the beautiful thing with fantasy, is it leaves it wide open for you. Now, you can do what a lot of people do, which is create or work within an existing subgenre. You could create your own steampunk book. You could create your own romance, comedy, fantasy book. I mean, whatever subgenre you want. Horror fantasy. You see a lot of dark horror fantasy people out there right now. If you want to be like J.S. Moran, he does space fantasy, which is slightly different than what I've seen. out there, but it's a perfectly legitimate area to be. So that's one way of dealing with it. The other thing is to use elements of other genres within your fantasy novel to highlight certain elements. Let's say you are moving into deep, dark dungeon, sort of your classic Dungeons and Dragons kind of moment. If you're having one of those, you might be using horror elements to sort of unfold it in the character's eyes to try and build a horror tension during that scene or scenes in the book. And after a certain point, if the horror elements are broken for the characters, you might stop using those elements. But they're a tool to help build that kind of tension in your story. It'll make the story richer than if you just strictly walk into this, dungeon with an evil necromancer at the end and be like, okay, you see a 10 by 10 flagstone hallway. That might perfectly describe it, but that does not bring in the horror element that you might want them to feel at that point. So part of it is what you want them to feel, and the other part of it is how do they deal with it. And I think a good way to break it down is it depends on what the characters feel. And also that would depend on the way you're presenting the book. But if you let the characters feel horror when they should, and you convey that through their thoughts and words to the reader, it will convey it to them the same way as if you're writing a horror book. But instead of even having a subgenre, maybe it's a scene or two or a couple scenes in your book, maybe even a good part of the book might have a horror base or a thriller base or whatever you want for that point. Maybe you have you're doing sort of a fish out of the water detective moment in a story where you have this large, crazy barbarian man who's in the city and his friend is killed and he has to do detective work in the way he's going to find out what happened to his friend. So he can either dispense justice or get revenge or whatever the plot is. But it's really sort of using appropriately other genre elements for specific scenes within your story. You can also use the genre elements when they don't fit. And I'll have a couple examples later on both ways, but this is something I find more interesting, and I think would typically lend a little bit more towards comedy, but it wouldn't have to. You could have a psychological issue where you have a kid who's waiting for his parent to come home and is frightened his parents are coming home. And within the imagination of that, the kid is generating the horror about a scene that should not have horror. And so you maybe have a little comic relief at the end or some existential discussion of the world if you want, however you want to deal with it at the end. But you could use it inappropriately because there's no real elements that should be causing horror except in the imagination of the character who's presenting the scenario. You could present, horror in a fantasy moment where you have the young kid crossing the dance floor to ask a girl out for the first time. He might be terrified because she's beautiful and he thinks he loves her. So he's crossing that dance floor, and what's going through his mind is not romance, it is horror. So there are lots of different ways you can use genre elements. They could be used in ways that make sense where you should have that element worked in there or where they don't. And now just for a couple of quick examples here. So you have a love story between two characters. So the easy thing to step into there is let's add romance elements to that. Let's build this relationship. Let's show evolving. Let's show the care between the two growing. You want to throw some erotica in at the end. That would be up to you. That would depend on your avatar. Probably get easier book sales that way, I guess. But the thing is, you're building the relationship the way you think the two characters' relationship should build. So it's really a romance thread throughout a novel, whether it's in a specific scene or it's peppered probably over many scenes, this relationship built. Or in a more sort of comical relief way, or at least I would find it comical, would be a love story between a character and his sword. And as a role-playing game master, I've kind of seen this where I've had players fall in love with magic items. So why not have a character fall in love with a magic item? And, you can watch the player or, the reader can watch the character interacting with this device like it's this other animate being, and it's not. But, he's building a relationship with the sword and falling in love with the sword and cradling the sword and taking way too much care of the sword. And you can actually have kind of a love story over an element like that is maybe trying to say something about the character or say something about, maybe it's just a parody thing that you're making fun of something else. But, it's important not to sit there and think, I'm doing this action adventure role-playing version of a game and I can't have romance or horror or supernatural, which supernatural usually gets fit into, but it's usually done in a fantasy way. So there are many ways to kind of deal with these things. But the thing is, don't box yourself in when you're storytelling on elements that you think are the major themes of the thing. So if you're creating an epic fantasy, and obviously romance is what usually makes it in, especially like if it's in modern mass production, and there's usually a love interest, and which is okay or not. I think, it can be overdone. There usually doesn't need to be a love interest for a story to exist, but that doesn't make them enjoyable for people to read. Or using horror to introduce a character in a book to a new, very scary kind of monster would be very appropriate. So use the elements as they make sense for the story. And the other thing is too, is if you're really trying to go for like a high kind of dramatic moment, where, maybe the hero gets killed or something along those lines where you have this very powerful moment you want to have happen. The thing I learned in theater was to build up to that moment, you go drama, 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 comedy. Drama, 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 comedy. And it's in those comedic reliefs in the comedy that as the dramatic tension builds, people start getting to a point where they can't get any more involved in the story. So you slap them with some comedy, some sort of relief from the strict drama, and that will relax them some. And when you do the next dramatic build in your story, it will elevate the tensions in them beyond where it could get before. And then when you get them to the height of the dramatic tension, that's when you pull off your high drama, the entire clan is murdered or whatever you want to do. That is the high drama. That's the point you do, is after you build it, give it a little bit of relief, build it, give it a little bit of relief. It's a sequence, it's you're adding into it each time. But you need some relief to give the people that emotional presence to allow them to build up more tension. All right. The rating for this episode is mixed because one, it can be anywhere you want it to be depending on how you want to deliver the story, who it's appropriate to, who your avatar is. There are a lot of things that go into determining how much of these elements you're going to need for your story or you want to use to make your story a little richer. But it's important to make your story richer. The world building task for the day. Mix more genres in with your current work in progress. Sit there and look, are there some ways I could either inappropriately or appropriately work some different types of storytelling elements into a story I'm working on? So just take any story you're working on, maybe it's even just experimental test kind of thing, and try and mix some genres that you've not dealt with before. And the beautiful thing is, between people and the internet, you can learn what you need to about the genre, about what makes a good romance story, what makes a good horror story, and try to incorporate those elements either in a way that's appropriate or even inappropriate to your story. And when I say inappropriate, I don't mean it hurts the story, but I do mean it's not the way people will conventionally see the genre being used. And they might not even consider it as those elements. Now, the real world task for the day, try and know what your next steps are. And the next steps are the actual next task you need to take to get to a goal. So if you're working on a story, if you're working on podcasting, if you're working on a project, always know the next thing you have to do, because when your time gets really crunched, you can sit there and quickly go, I need to get this one thing done. Or maybe I have 3 or 4 things going on at once. Maybe I have like 8 things going on at one time. I can sit there and make sure I at least get my next steps done. And maybe I don't have the time to really plan out as much as I want to at that moment. But at least I know what I can get done next. And then when I get through all of my next steps, I can then plan what my next steps are again. And, that's from sort of surviving during a project. It's just a useful thing to always know what are the next steps that you need to take. And then take them. Make sure to take them. The tease for this episode is Bedrachum Magic. And this will be about carving magic. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at Garduel.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike while the myth rolls high.